on the parables. And today we want to talk about several parables that have to do with sowing and harvesting. So if you could begin by turning to Matthew 13, we'll start there in just a moment. But first I want to continue talking about a little bit the purpose of parables. We talked last time about how rabbis use parables as the handles of a basket. If the idea was to pick up a basket full of teaching about the law, the parables helped understand how to get hold of the teaching and how to put it into practice. And Jesus often talks about the kingdom of God in his teaching. And so a number of parables begin with something like, the kingdom of heaven is like a man who, or the kingdom of heaven is like a seed, the kingdom of heaven is like a king, and then it will explain something about the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven. And I think there's several purposes here. One is so that we will understand, so that we can grab the handles and pick up the basket and be able to use what's in the basket for our lives. Second, I think Jesus wants to correct misperceptions or errors about what people think the kingdom is and is going to be. We know that one of the most common misperceptions or downright mistakes that the Jews had regarding the Messiah was that he was going to be an earthly leader who would bring an earthly kingdom and they could reign then in the kingdom. But there are a number of other misconceptions about what the kingdom of heaven would be. And so Jesus wants to say it's not maybe all that you think, or it is what you think, but in a different way. And so he wanted to correct the misperceptions. And then I think a third purpose probably of the kingdom of heaven teachings was so that we would want to be a part of it. I don't know if you've had the experience of reading certain novels that are based on true principles, but they're fiction, or maybe they're even fantasy, like the Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. And I remember reading some of those books and wishing that I could be a part of the lands or the situations described in the books. And I think Jesus wants to talk and for his hearers to say, I want to be a part of that kingdom. Is that even possible? It's not a faraway land. It's not a fairy tale. And Jesus is saying, yes, this is possible. And the good news is that the kingdom of heaven is arriving even as I speak. And so he wants to invite people to be part of it. And he wants them to long to be a part of it. And I think as you read through the parables, you think, I wish it were really that way. And it can be that way. So let's look and do just a little bit of reading about the kingdom of heaven through these parables of sowing and reaping. Beginning in Matthew 13:1. That same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat by the lake. And we're assuming he went out of the house, say like in Capernaum, and sat by the lake somewhere near Capernaum. And we'll show you a little bit in just a minute about that. Such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat in it, while all the people stood on the shore. Then he told them many things in parables, saying, a farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched, and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants. Still other seed fell on good soil, where it produced a crop, 100, 60, or 30 times what was sown. Whoever has ears, let them hear. The disciples came to him and asked, why do you speak to the people in parables? He replied, because the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven has been given to you, but not to them. Whoever has will be given more, and they will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them. This is why I speak to them in parables. Though seeing, they do not see. Though hearing, they do not hear or understand. In them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah. You will ever be hearing, but never understanding. You will ever be seeing, but never perceiving. For this people's heart has become calloused. They hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, and understand with their hearts, and turn, and I would heal them. But blessed are your eyes because they see, and your ears because they hear. For truly I tell you, many prophets and righteous people longed to see what you see, but did not see it, and to hear what you hear, but did not hear it. Now let me stop just for a minute and talk about what I just read and compare it to what I said about parables. We said that parables were used to help people understand the law and to take hold of it and live it. And here it almost looks like Jesus is saying, well, I'm speaking in parables to hide the meaning. But that's really not the case. He talks about the knowledge of the kingdom of heaven being given to certain ones of the audience. And the idea seems to be that when he uses parables and people receive them with an open heart and they want to learn, that they receive gladly the knowledge of the kingdom of heaven that he wants to give. And so they do understand and they can put it into practice. The ones that the knowledge is hidden from are the ones whose hearts are callous, where they should be able to see and hear and feel and respond to God, and yet they're so calloused and so insensitive to what God has done or is doing that even though it could be theirs, they can't understand it. And so it's not as if God wants to hide it from them on purpose. He wants all people to come to a knowledge of the truth, but they choose or have chosen not to receive that. So hopefully that clarifies that just a little bit. Now going back to the reading in verse 18, the explanation of the parable. Listen then to what the parable of the sower means. When anyone hears the message about the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what was sown in their heart. This is the seed sown along the path. The seed falling on rocky ground refers to someone who hears the word and at once receives it with joy, but since they have no root, they last only a short time. When trouble or persecution comes because of the word, they quickly fall away. The seed falling among the thorns refers to someone who hears the word, but the worries of this life and the deceitfulness of wealth choke the word, making it unfruitful. But the seed falling on good soil refers to someone who hears the word and understands it. This is the one who produces a crop, yielding 100, 60, or 30 times what was sown. Now, before we go into talking more about the parable itself, let me give you a little bit of the context geographically. Here is a picture of the shore of the Sea of Galilee, very near Capernaum. And as you're looking at this shore, kind of where there's a little cove there, that's called the Cove of the Sower, because they think this parable was probably told right around this area, maybe in this very cove. And then if you look to behind the cove to the road, that's the Via Maris, the road that runs by the sea that's been there for 5,000 years. And then to the right on up the hill, that's the Mount of Beatitudes that we've already seen. And then if you go down that road about maybe a mile or two to the right, then you'll be in the town of Capernaum. And so it's very likely that Jesus, when it says he went out of the house and sat by the lake, he may have gone out of Capernaum and come down to this area to teach and kind of get away from the city where there's a bigger area for people to sit and listen. And also where there's a road where more people will be coming by, making the word really available. Now, if you're out on the water, this is what this area would look like. The general area, it's not the whole area. And then, as I mentioned, here's the Mount of Beatitudes. And then up on the top in the middle, you see just the little dome of the Church of the Beatitudes right there. And if you were sitting up on that hill at a different time of year, the previous picture was probably more in the summer, but this is what the Cove of the Sower would look like if you were seated and looking down on the road, and then also maybe Jesus in a boat sitting there teaching. And they've done tests of this area. Scientists have come to test the acoustics because they've wondered, how can Jesus go and speak to crowds of hundreds or even thousands of people and be heard? And they found that this area is kind of a natural amphitheater, and that you could stand on the shore and speak in a pretty normal voice, about like I'm speaking now, and could be heard all around. So that may be another reason why I chose this area as well. And then as you travel around this area, and not only this part of Israel, but other parts, you see terrain like this. This happens to be in the Negev desert, south of a place called Maktesh Ramon. It's a national park. And you see how desolate this is. A lot of rocky soil here that's mentioned. And then you have more rocky soil in that same kind of area. Up in the north, a lot nearer Galilee and Capernaum, is the town of Safat up on the hill. And you can see even in places where there's grass, there's just tons of rocks, millions of rocks around the countryside there. And even if you were sitting on the hill there by the Mount of Beatitudes, even though that area is pretty green and pretty, you would have like less than 3 miles away, the area that's around Chorazin, about 3 miles away, is also pretty desolate, a lot of volcanic rock, a lot of dirt. And so you could walk around that area and see all 4 kinds of soil just within maybe 2 or 3 miles. And so the people are from that area. And so when Jesus is telling this parable, he's saying, look, you're living among these 4 kinds of terrain, and you've probably seen this parable happen maybe as you tried to plant your crops. So this would have been a well-known story. And so as they look at this sower story, they and also we would have some lessons that were pretty well known. We've probably talked about it, and you've probably studied some before in other classes, how we see that the sower casts the seed everywhere. A good sower would do that because he never knows exactly where a seed might grow, and so he casts the seed everywhere. A second thing that you've probably heard is that because of this, all kinds of people hear the gospel. And then third, there will be all kinds of reactions and motives for hearing and responding or not. And then because of that, fourth, there are all kinds of harvests. And so those are things that seem pretty clear from the story, and Jesus mentions some of those. I also want to add some other ideas. One is that the idea that we need to sow everywhere, because really, when it's all is said and done, only God knows where the really fertile earth is. Since we can't know everything about an area or what might happen in the next weeks or months as we plant and wait for our crop to come up, then we sow everywhere because some soil and results might surprise us. And sometimes we can be deceived even about where the soil is fertile or not, or whether people might be receptive to the gospel or not. Sometimes we have people that we think would be great students of the word and great disciples and become great leaders and Christians and be totally mistaken. While another person, like if we had been in Jerusalem when Paul was persecuting the church, probably all of us would have thought, don't let that guy anywhere near the church, because there is no way that Paul is ever going to believe anything about Jesus. He's killing people and putting them in prison now. There is no way Paul is ever going to change. And yet, just a short time later, Paul becomes one of the most effective missionaries and church planters in the history of the church. And so it's easy for us to be mistaken. And so again, that's why we need to sow everywhere. And sometimes we'll see in another parable this a little more clearly later, but even the harvest can deceive us, because I'm sure that the seed that falls on rocky ground and comes up quickly can look really good for a while, and then after a while it's disappointing and it doesn't last. So again, the whole idea is that our responsibility is to sow, and then God is in charge of what happens after that. Now let's talk just a little bit more about each kind of terrain and what happens. Often we've studied this story from the perspective of someone who is sowing and teaching the word, and then we talk about the people who are listening and how they respond. And I think that's fair. We need to think about the people we're addressing and also how they respond. But at least I know from a teacher and preacher point of view, from a minister point of view, it's easy for us to think that we've done everything well in teaching and sowing, and yet actually we may have missed some things about sowing that have made it very difficult for people to respond to the gospel. And when they don't respond, our tendency is to blame the people that didn't respond, because we think, well, we did everything we were supposed to, and what's wrong with these people? And so I want to talk a little bit from the point of view of the sower, of the teacher, of the minister who works sharing the gospel with people. And, you know, for right now, we're going to let God worry about the terrain and the people and how they receive the gospel. I want to talk about how we can share the gospel effectively so that the harvest can maybe be more unimpeded. Okay, so first of all, it talks about the seed on the path. And if you look back here at verse 19, there was a phrase that I never really read or saw or paid attention to, I guess, before just maybe 2 or 3 years ago. And it says, when anyone hears the message about the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what was sown in their heart. And for some reason, I never got that piece about and does not understand it. Now, you think about that just for a minute. In the process of teaching or of sowing, then there's two pieces to that. One is the teacher and how the teacher teaches, and the other is the listener and how he or she understands or receives it. And often, in my experience anyway, if someone doesn't understand something about a Bible class or about any topic really, often it can be because the teacher is not teaching clearly. Now, I know that, students say that all the time. It's not my fault. It was the teacher's fault. He didn't explain it well. And I know that there's students that don't pay attention. But just thinking about this, it impressed upon me the responsibility of the teacher. What if I'm teaching the gospel in such a way that's not clear to people? What if these people would have responded if I had prepared better or prepared differently, if I was more interesting? What if it's my fault that they didn't understand it? They tried, but the way I taught it obscured the message instead of revealing it. And so the seed is just laying there on the path and they want to pick it up, but they haven't been able to yet. And at that moment, then the devil comes in and snatches away their opportunity. And maybe they lose interest, or maybe they think I'm not smart enough, or maybe God doesn't love me enough to reveal this to me, and they get discouraged and they go away. And the opportunity is lost. And so I'm thinking that for those of us who teach and preach and share the gospel, which should be everyone, right? But particularly the ones that may do it full time or for their vocation, we need to see about how we're teaching the gospel, to see if we're doing our very best to present it in an interesting, understandable fashion, so that if someone doesn't receive it, it's not because it wasn't clear or understandable. It was because they chose not to receive it. I would hate to be responsible for not teaching well and people missing a chance to respond to the gospel. And maybe this is why James says in chapter 3, not many of you should be teachers, because those who teach will be judged more strictly. I think that perhaps it's important for us to really make sure we're doing a good job of making the gospel understandable. And then continued on the idea of perhaps having our responsibility as teachers and preachers, we move on to the soil of plants that grow up quickly but have no roots. And so you wonder, what makes a person like a plant without roots? And perhaps it's again part of the responsibility of the teacher or minister or preacher, because perhaps the teacher hasn't prepared the person enough for the commitment that's necessary, that perhaps they don't know about the suffering that will come eventually to any Christian, the difficult times that will be hard to be faithful, the things that we don't understand, or perhaps there's a number of other distracting factors that are cluttering the soil around the person so that they're distracted by what's around them and they can't pay attention to the gospel. And all of this makes me think about, what we do before, as we're teaching the gospel, before they understand and confess and are baptized and begin their Christian life. How have we prepared the soil? Are there things we could do to make everything crystal clear and to clear away distractions and impediments? And then after they become Christians, do we follow up with the people and say, okay, now, here's what it looks like to live the Christian life. Here's what you need to stop doing. Here's what you need to start doing. And I know that I don't mean necessarily a list of 20 things of each, because that's rule-based and we want relationship-based. But again, are we following up with the person and saying, here's what it looks like to live a Christian life. And in this situation, here are some things a Christian does. And here's what Jesus would want you to do or say or respond. So again, there's a lot of training and follow-up. And sometimes that hasn't always been our main focus or the most popular thing or the most showy thing. because at least in the tradition I was raised in, the idea was, well, if you can bring more people to the Lord and baptize more people and the church grows, then you've done your job. And so there's a tendency to get through the baptism, welcome the person to the church, and then go on to find other people that need to hear the gospel. And then we end up losing people that have come into the church and accepted the gospel with joy, but because there wasn't follow-up and training and encouragement in those first weeks and months after they became a Christian, then they fell away. And so the root withered, the plant withers. But when the trials come and they don't understand some things, they assume it's their fault. They assume it wasn't a real conversion. They assume maybe God doesn't care anymore. They assume the church doesn't care. And so they go away. And again, that may be more on us than on the people who come. They're new to all this. What do they know about what's expected? We have to be the ones to prepare and to train and then to educate and disciple after they become Christians. And so I want to show you a couple of other pictures here. This is a picture of the Negev desert between Jerusalem and Jericho, kind of that general area. And what strikes me in this is just the utter desolation of it. You see kind of a wadi there, kind of a ravine. You see the hills. This can be really, really hot and dry, especially in the summer, and just, no vegetation at all. It's just desolate. But if you go just a few miles down the road, the Israelis have learned how to cultivate the desert so that they've made the desert into areas that produce surprising amounts of crops and different kinds of crops. And it's largely due to irrigation. They found out a new kind of irrigation, drip irrigation basically, and they know how to cultivate sections of land in the desert so that it's arable land. So it's like they can plant crops and reap harvest from them. And the only difference between this picture and the previous picture, basically, is irrigation and attention. It strikes me that there's a great deal to be learned from that when we think about the work of a minister in preparing and teaching and following up. Okay. Then the third kind of land is the thorns, the thorny ground. And the question would be then, as a minister, once again, what can we do to help people see the dangers of what Jesus calls the deceitfulness of wealth or the pleasures of the world that tend to distract, and Jesus says, choke out the word that's in them. And this is even harder because we're not talking about trials and suffering here. We're talking about things that are pleasurable. And we know how hard it is once we get comfortable, once we like something, to give it up. It's a lot harder. And so if there's not, again, some teaching done about how even good things can be distractions that can choke out our Christian life, then again, we're failing the people that we're teaching. It's not that we don't want any good things. It's not that, God didn't make a lot of good things for blessings to enjoy, but it's a matter of how we use them in our lives. And if the good things and the pleasurable things ever become more important than the Lord, then they're choking out the word. And we can say this about any good thing. Anything can choke out the word and distract us from following the Lord. And I think that probably all of us who are watching this video, I know for me, for sure, it's easy to let things choke out the focus on God, to make us be distracted. And so the trick here is to find the balance between working and the church, working at being, learning and being better Christians and growing, and also at the same time enjoying the good things. God gave us those as well. And so we need to find that balance of, our job, making money, helping our families, and also being plugged into the church and growing as Christians. One person referred to this as passing the test of prosperity. We've heard about passing the test of suffering or of deprivation, but sometimes prosperity is a test that we fail, because if we're too prosperous, then we can forget about the Lord. Now, then, of course, you have the good soil, and in that case, then it's a happy ending because people respond to the Lord, they stay faithful, they're not choked out, they don't wither quickly, they flourish and they grow and they give much fruit. And hopefully, we can help people all arrive to that point if we do the things we mentioned, making the gospel understandable, preparing the ground, following up, and then avoiding things choking out our commitment to the Lord. That will produce growth in the good ground. Now, some questions then follow on the end of this. What kind of harvest best describes you right now? Which of these four kinds of earth? And so, for example, if you're the seed that's taken away, or the word in the path, what would help you understand the word better? Because the listener, the learner, does have a responsibility also. It's not all on the teacher. And so if you're finding that you're not understanding the word, it could be because the teacher's not doing a good job. And you might say, I don't understand what you're telling me. Could you find a different way to explain it, or find someone else to help you explain it? That sounds a little bit rude, but sometimes it's necessary. And so if you can find ways to understand the word better, then that can help you in that position. If you're the shallow-rooted plant that's quick to grow but then not quick to last, what would help the word get deeper in your life? Do you have just 30 seconds a day that you spend with the word? When you read the word, do you ask yourself and ask the Lord, how can I apply this word then today in my life? Does the word have a chance to get deep down into the ground that you're planted in? And I think sometimes, again, the listener has the responsibility to realize, hey, I'm not growing, and I'm really not spending hardly any time in this new commitment. And so I need to ask for help so that I can make the word and the relationship with Jesus a much more important part of my life. The third question would be, if you're the plant being choked, then look around and see what's choking you most right now. Sometimes we don't know. Sometimes it's the devil is deceitful and he blinds us to what's happening. But often we kind of know, and sometimes we clearly know, and yet we don't want to give it up because it's pleasurable. And we don't know what our lives would be like if we took that away and replaced it with the Lord. And sometimes that's a scary thing, because what we know, the pleasures we know, is more comforting than what we don't know yet. And that is how the Lord might come in and change our lives, how he would replace that pleasure. We think, how can anything be as good as this pleasure, and scratch that itch? And yet the Lord can surprise us, usually with much more than we even imagine. And then if you are the flourishing plant, look around and see what's helping you flourish, and really identify those things and hang on to them so that you can stay faithful. And then look around at other plants around you, other people, and see in what way you can help other people become this plant that's flourishing. If you can help the ground be better prepared, if you can help the weeds being taken out and not choking the person, if you can help other people understand the word better and live it, then you can be a great blessing. When it talks about the multiplying 30 and 60 and 100-fold, I think those are the Christians that have really taken hold, and they begin to do the work of the teacher and the discipler and the trainer. And that's how they multiply and produce fruit. So I hope that this first part of parables about sowing and reaping has been helpful to you. Maybe you've thought about some new things that you hadn't thought about before. And we'll continue in the next part of this class talking about other parables that have to do with the same topic. See you then.